Take a person, take a story, take you on a journey. It's your take.
On today's Your Take, I'm joined by a young woman who has worked in many capacities: a freelance journalist, a commentator, a co-convenor of the Battle of Ideas Festival, and an advocate for free speech. A university graduate who studied English literature, today's guest has gone on to do many interesting things. She is a published author who wrote What Women Want, Fun Freedom and an End to Feminism. She is the commissioning editor of Letters of Liberty, a radical campaign published by the Academy of Ideas, a columnist at Spiked, and a contributor to their weekly podcast. She also appears regularly in the media, commentating on the topics of the day on programmes such as Question Time, Sky News, LBC, Channel 4, and other outlets. She's also one half of Lobster Films, production company making political documentaries and content. My guest today is Ella Whelan. We turn the clock back to look at Ella's early life and her education, her long-established career as a respected columnist and commentator, life in the media spotlight, what makes her tick, and her views on politics, free thinking, public debate, and the freedom of thought and speech. A warm good morning and welcome. Ella, thanks for joining me today on Your Take.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
The introduction, we mentioned that you've worked in so many roles and different capacities, and we're obviously going to cover much of that in today's discussion. To start with, though, can I go back to the very beginnings and the very roots? You were born on December the 14th in 1991, growing up on an inner city London estate. I wanted to ask, what are your memories of your upbringing? Can you tell us who your parents are, what they did for a living, and do you have siblings?
Yeah, so I grew up in North London and I had a great childhood. My parents are both Irish, from a little place called Dunard in County Wicklow, which is in the Wicklow Mountains, just below, about an hour from Dublin. But my mum grew up in Tottenham, so she was same as me, a kind of a London Irish girl. And I have a little brother who's not so little anymore, and we had a great time. Very kind of, it was London in those days. I mean, still London is I think a wonderful place to raise kids. I'm about to have a kid myself in about 5 days or something. So I'm following my parents' footsteps. We had, great amount of freedom to go out and kind of claim the city as our own, particularly as we got into our teenage years. It was a great way to get accustomed to the world. And a few kind of hairy moments here and there, but in the round, it was just like London was our playground, and that was a sort of fantastic thing. And the fact that my parents were, particularly my father was an Irish immigrant, brought a certain kind of different element to life. Our house was sometimes like a little island in a very wonderful way. I've went to a Roman Catholic school where there was lots of Irish people, and also it was very mixed, in a classic kind of inner city school. And I still have friends there from my time there. And then I suppose made quite a large transition into secondary school. I went to a grammar school outside of London, that my dad had sort of drilled me for all the way through year 6 in verbal reasoning and all these like things that I couldn't do now, tests in order to get into the school. I remember we used to have this little red desk in my in the bedroom that me and my brother had, and the horrors of having to every night go and sit by the red desk with my dad to learn how shapes fit into another shape and all that kind of stuff that you have to do to get into those kind of schools. But fair play to my dad, he got me in. And that was a whole different world of life in Potter's Bar, which was very different to inner London. Certainly not so mixed, certainly not so people on a different kind of from a different background to me, but great times. And that's where I was very into music, and the school had great provisions, and I had a great time there. But it was a kind of, sometimes you did feel a bit like you were living a bit of not a double life, but it was interesting leaving the suburbs and coming back to the dirty smoke of London, which is always my preference. I'll never leave London, I don't think. But in the round, it was very uneventful. It was in the best way possible, in that, you just had a good time. My parents were political people. They, politics was talked about at the kitchen table from as far back as I can remember. They're involved in politics themselves, not party politics, but sort of organizing discussions. They used to be part of a magazine, and so I had a kind of, we would be having debates and discussions from a very young age. So I was always somewhat interested in what was happening in the world, and it's to them that I owe my interest in politics and love for politics, because I think they really gave that to me.
Fond, distinctive memories of childhood and growing up in the capital, and you've already spoken about your Celtic Irish roots and coming very much from a free-thinking family. I wanted to pick up on schooling, which you touched upon, and I wanted to ask you where you were schooled and talk specifically in more detail about it, but were they particularly memorable or happy times in your life? And what subjects did you particularly excel in? And did you have any early career ambitions?
Yeah, well, so I went to St. Joan of Arc School, which is the primary school. And the interesting thing about that, other than how interesting primary school life can be, was that when I first went, it was run by a nun, and had a very different kind of, obviously I don't remember this, but it's this from talking to my parents, but that it was a lot more discipline orientated. It was your kind of traditional Catholic school, and it was quite high achieving. It was a pretty good school for that particular area of in North London, kind of Highbury, and it changed, the leadership changed halfway through, and a lot of the kind of stuff that's happening, there's far more commonplace in education now, in terms of have a greater focus on well-being. A kind of a new head teacher came in who had sort of instituted circle time and things like this, and it sort of shifted the focus of the school, which would have been previously kind of like crack the whip, nuns, learn your times tables, and then became this sort of less a sort of focus on academic life and more a focus on sort of holistic, how the children feel, which I think most people, when you say that, say, well, what's wrong with it? But in actual fact, the standards slipped. And I think that there's something, now when I'm thinking about where I'm going to send my kid in a few years, even though I'm not don't believe in any religion. I'm not a Catholic or anything like that anymore. Insofar as I was when I was a kid, I do think I want to find a school with some nuns, because at least you have some sense of sort of academic rigor and a tradition and discipline. So, that was interesting. And then obviously the grammar school I went to, which is called Dame Alice Owens, out in Potter's Bar, was, it was like being in a sweet shop every day, because the resources they had were infinite. It was brilliant. And, any kind of, if you wanted to, whatever you wanted to do, they were very, I can't fault them. It was really a great thing that my dad got me into that school. I remember on the day of the exam, I had to I did an exam for another school called Latimer. Thank God I didn't get into that, because I think that's I know a lot of people from Latimer and they're not very nice. But I remember I'd gotten, and then I had to do the exam for De Malasson's, and I'd been stung in the eye by a bee. So my eye was like, I could only see out of one eye, and the pressure of like, you've been working all the way through year 6 to try and get into this school. And also you're like 10 and mortified by your parents and everyone around you. And the one thing you don't want to do is sit in a room full of 10-year-olds who are also strangers. So that was like a block out that day, because that was like a bit traumatic. But yeah, once you got in, I think it just is an example of, there's an interesting debate about grammar schools, about state schools, private schools, and fairness in terms of people being able to get in. And I was very lucky that I had parents that were willing and able to let me jump past the barriers that other inner city kids would have had, working class kids, in terms of just putting in the man hours to bring me up to the level so that I could compete to get in. And that's a wonderful gift that my parents gave me. Not everybody has that, but there's a kind of, I think you can't deny that the level of rigor and academic rigor and dedication in these schools is something that all kids should have. And I sort of, I don't really know where I stand on the kind of abolish all private schools thing, because I don't think that necessarily fixes anything. What I'd like to see is every state school be brought up to be given the resources, and the teachers be given the things they need to be brought up to the level of the kind of school that I went to. Because it's a cliche to say that school is one of the most important places in your life, but it really is, because it just gives you the confidence and the groundwork to go on and do whatever you want to do once you leave.
You've spoken about your early experiences at Catholic school and having the opportunity to be educated at a grammar school. I wanted to move slightly forward and keep on the topic of academia and now discuss your tenure at university. I wanted to ask you, what did you study at undergraduate level? And can you discuss your time studying for a master's in English literature at the University of Sussex?
Yeah, so I wasn't meant to go to Sussex. I tried to get into Cambridge, as all young big heads do, and failed. and my boyfriend at the time, when I was at school, got in, and I was outraged about the fact that, full of sort of the idea that there was prejudice rather than I just wasn't good enough. And I was halfway through celebrating with my friends on results day that we'd all got in, and I'd actually applied to get into Queen Mary's in London, and realised that there'd been some screw up on how I'd done the application. And so then I actually ended up with no university place, and I only got into Sussex through clearing, that kind of lottery system that people find. So I was sort of like half cut in my friend's kitchen celebrating, and then had to sober up and stop crying and get on the laptop to try and get myself a university place. I ended up at Sussex, and actually, as it happens, my parents used to live in Brighton when they were younger, and it's somewhere that I've always been. So the place I wanted to go because it was by the seaside, in all honesty. I don't think people should pretend, like I was reading Shakespeare from the age of 15 and I knew that I wanted to go. That's shite, I wanted to be by the seaside, and Sussex looked like a fun university. And as it happens, it has a fantastic English literature department. And I'd studied English literature at undergrad there, and it was just a wonderful 3 years. It was, the kind of stuff that we did study was really broad in terms of we used to go to sort of evening classes with this group of lecturers who were really interested in early modern studies, and they'd do evening classes on these sort of like bizarre medieval texts that were all about cats that could talk and sex and all the weird stuff they got up to in the Dark Ages and beyond. And it was things I'd never come across before, and then some kind of exciting big political ideas about which is something that's the wonderful thing about studying English literature, is that obviously literature is more often than not a kind of what's being written at a particular time reflects the society that it's in. So, looking back through kind of a range of texts and having a kind of looking glass aspect into life in particular times in history. And I just loved all that. And I ended up specializing in kind of modernist texts. And I was really into Samuel Beckett, which was, like typical pretentious student. And if I go back and read my essays on Samuel Beckett now, it makes me wince. But at the time I was just having a ball being kind of immersed in all this stuff, and was very sort of excited by the political atmosphere at Sussex. It was a campus that was really alive to student activism, a lot of it kind of like performative and pointless, I can admit now. But at the time, you were really convinced that when you marched through Library Square and up to the Vice Chancellor's building, that the whole world was watching you. And there were occupations at Sussex of buildings, and there were, demonstrations about this, that, and the other. We were at university at the time when the cuts came in, the kind of education cuts, and when they changed the rules around how student unions were organized. So they became no longer student unions, but became part of a sort of link to the university. And we were protesting all of that. And I was in the protests in Parliament Square, that, the kind of famous 2010 and 2011 ones that descended into sort of ridiculousness. But we were young, fancied ourselves anyway as young student radicals. But there was a serious element to it, which was that you were in a kind of environment in which people were throwing around ideas and talking about big things, asking you what you thought about big ideologies. What do you think about capitalism? What do you think about communism? Even if it was a kind of a sort of student level, it was challenging and eye-opening and exciting. And that's where I met my husband. There he was that was at the time he was in the Socialist Workers' Party, and he always had his little stall on Library Square, and we used to row all the time because I don't like the SWP. So it was great. It was had two levels to it. It was kind of both academically sort of very interesting, but also politically somewhere quite exciting. And I just, again, in being honest, I just decided that I was having such a good time there and that enjoying my studies so much that I carried on to an MA. I mean, lots of people go to different universities, but I thought, I'm not ready to leave this place yet. I still like Brighton too much and I still like this, so I'll stay for another year. And ended up doing an MA in contemporary literature, that was really good because you could we did, reading groups on Marx. We did kind of courses in philosophy on people who I now think are not worth reading, like Deleuze and Guattari and all this kind of like guff. But anyway, at the time it was interesting, and ended up doing my final MA dissertation on Samuel Beckett. So, but by the time then it was sort of 4 years of studying and writing essays and, slightly looking up my own backside as all students do. And I was ready to, go back to London and start life properly. But it was a really wonderful 4 years.
Ella, I want to pick up on this political theme because early in our discussion, you spoke about it almost being instilled when you were young because your parents were political thinkers. Now we're at a chapter where you're at university and you become, I guess, maybe more politically aware. You're involved in demonstrations and things you feel particularly passionate about. But I wanted to ask you, what particularly interested you about the notion of free speech and also feminism, and what made you want to go on and debate and actually write in detail and research these particular subjects?
Yeah, so my parents are from a particular left-wing tradition, and would kind of take the piss out of me really a bit when I'd come back home on a weekend from university and be full of information about how, you know, people were occupying the student building at Sussex and how important it was, when in actual fact it was like, you know, sort of a bunch of us sort of slightly grubby students making a mess in a student building. It really wasn't kind of like world-changing stuff. And so they'd always challenge me, and, you know, it's kind of, you know, in fact, unfortunately, a lot of the sort of student radical movement, or whatever you want to call it at the time, was quite, it was the beginnings of a problem of campus censorship. And so there would be, you know, for example, I remember times where a speaker would come to the university, you know, a couple of times it was sort of like a Tory MP or something like that, and they'd get chased off campus, and or the debate would be cancelled. And you know, you start to think, well, hang on a minute, what, you know, okay, we don't politically agree with this person, but why are we trying to cancel this event? This doesn't seem like the right way to go about things. And I started to read the magazine Spiked, who, as it happens, one of its two of its key writers at the time, a man called Luke Gittos and a man called Tom Slater, had also been Sussex, just chance, had been Sussex alumni. And they kind of, I was reading them, we got in contact, and I decided in my last year of my undergrad to hold a debate with it, you know, with the help of Spiked, and Tom and Luke came along on the campus about free speech on campus. And they had a particular campaign that was about campus free speech and the problem with it, and, you know, the fact that there were these kind of censorious policies being brought in by students' unions at the time, zero tolerance policies to harassment, which on the face of it sounds like a nice thing, but actually amounts to controlling what kind of speech can take place on campus, you know, not allowing certain kinds of jokes, and in particular, we sort of start to see the rise of things like no platform policies, which had been around for a very long time, but were starting to expand out from just like a handful of genuinely fascist organizations to Tory MPs, controversial speakers, you know, people, kind of nasty people that students don't like. And so we had this debate, we got a really good crowd, and it was very successful. But lots of the people who I'd been politically active with at Sussex were in the crowd, horrified at the fact that I thought free speech was a good thing. And I sort of kind of started to realize that there was a real problem with a lot of the student movements, in which there was just this sort of trigger happy desire to press the ban button, and that actually free speech was seen to be this uncontroversial thing, which you kind of, you know, you think, or you say, well, of course people should be able to have a debate and say what they think. And in actual fact, a lot of people don't think that. A lot of people at student level don't think that. They kind of, there's, for a variety of reasons, cultural and political shifts, are less inclined to go to university able to have that kind of free and frank open platform for debate. And I just decided that this was such an important thing, and that it was the notion of fighting for free speech was so exciting and fit into everything that I thought about life, you know, about how you become a individual, how you think about your workplace, how you think about your relationships, how you think about what you want the world to look like. And so I was hooked, and so that was it for me. Then I was, you know, ready to be involved in all of these campaigns that Spiked was doing, and ready to be I wasn't a campus pariah, because, you know, nobody knew who I was, but ready to make myself one, in order to kind of stand up for free speech. So it was it was a real watershed moment, actually, of having my eyes open to how important this issue was.
Let's come on next to, you mentioned Spiked, and you also mentioned about the proprietors of the online magazine. We'll cast the clock back to your graduation, 2014, and you joined the online political magazine Spiked. And I wanted to ask you, how did that opportunity come about, and what specifically attracted you to wanting to write for the magazine?
Well, I was, I had never done anything like it. Actually, when I finished university, I didn't immediately go work for Spiked. I worked as a student, school administrator in a school, just like, like an office lady and a nurse, sort of sticking plasters and watching over detentions in a school. And, throughout my university career, I always worked, but I did things like I was a cook in a care home for a year, cleaning jobs, babysitting jobs, anything I could get my hands on, but nothing writing related, nothing politics related, call centers and things like that. And so then when I had been a big fan of Spiked and had written a few things for them, with a lot of having my hand held, because it's a very difficult thing to write a political article. It's completely different from your average 2,500 word waffly student bit of essaying. And they said, do you want to come try out as a staff writer? And it was really exciting. They had an office in sort of central East London, and it was like going into a different universe, into a hub of politics where people were thinking, about, you had to know what was going on the day in the world. You had to be ready if someone asked you, what do you think about the US elections? Things that you just, as a lazy young person, you wouldn't have thought about. And it was a real sharp learning curve. And to go in there, that was at the time that Brendan O'Neill was the editor, and it was just really exciting and challenging, and go home and fall in a heap because I was so knackered of trying to catch up with the level that they were at. And also, it was a real change in pace in terms of me as a writer. I wasn't a writer. I was not a writer. And they whipped me into shape, and, there were lots of jokes about the fact that my grammar was terrible, because one of the terrible admissions is that I always used to send my university essays to my mother to edit it, because I hated editing. So I used to send it off to my mum and she'd give it a proof for me. So I was really bad at editing, and actually my grammar was not up to scratch for someone who wanted to work for a serious publication. So, it was a painful few months of realizing that I was very lacking in terms of skill. But once, if it's something that you're interested in, you catch on very quickly. And, we were doing very exciting things with campus culture, but also it was where you mentioned the stuff about feminism. Once you get into the world of politics and the media, I, started to realize how much focus there was on this kind of very patronizing idea that young women were diametrically opposed to young men, that they needed help, that there was this real narrative at the time. It was sort of like the campaigns, everyday sexism, and there were so many TV programs and media debates about how awful life was for women. And I just did not recognize that as a reality, and could see how kind of what a sort of fashion it was in contemporary politics to really indulge in this kind of victim orientated sort of picture of women, and it just kind of disgusted me, in all honesty. And I thought, this is not what women's liberation should be about. This is not this kind of like drippingly middle class pity party. So Spiked gave me the opportunity. They said, well, all right, write about it. And so I started to pick apart any kind of headline that came out, or any kind of campaign that launched to sort of save the girls. I'd have a great time trying to make mincemeat of, and it was, actually, to give the fullest of credit to Spiked, we were pretty much the only publication at that time in the early days. Now lots of other people have cottoned on. We were the only publication that was saying, this is not what women's freedom is about, and actually making ourselves in some cases quite unpopular by saying, this contemporary feminist stuff is just a load of nonsense and it's not going to help women. And it was a tricky thing to convince people of, because you sound like, you know, you say, if you say you're not interested in contemporary feminism, people think you're a men's rights activist, or that you're a misogynist, or, you know, there's this kind of really lazy assumption that you just hate women if you're not interested in, you know, what some columnist who's written a book on feminism is as interested in. And so it was a kind of like, it was a real challenge to get the point across of, you can be in favor of women's freedom and, you know, all the things we used to write about, decriminalizing abortion, you know, arguing for better childcare, talking about genuine women's freedom out on the streets, and not just kind of like women's safety, but women's freedom, and not be the kind of pink badge wearing member of the club. And yeah, to Spike's credit, it was a real leap that that I took with them, in terms of being able to stick our neck out and say that. And so it was a very exciting time.
Ella, you've worked on and off for Spiked for 8 years, and you became its assistant editor. What are the most memorable memories writing and acting as an editor for the magazine? And are there any pieces you've written that you're most proud of, and why?
I think probably some of the most exciting things I wrote were about women, and were about challenging, you know, particularly around when the Me Too movement broke out in 2017, I think it was, with those sort of rumblings around 2016. It was anyway, somewhere around that time. And we were the kind of first to come out and say, you know, there is something weird going on here, where you have a bunch of celebrities in Hollywood who, okay, are talking about one particular individual, Harvey Weinstein, who, you know, anyone can see is a sort of very immoral character who deserves everything that comes to him. That this kind of like a snowballing effect of some celebrities tweeting turning into every woman being invited to sort of like bare her soul on social media and weep about the time, not even serious things, you know, that should be talked about, like sexual harassment or even rape, but the time some guy looked at her on a bus funny, or the time someone dared to ask her out at a bar, or things like that. And it was just like there was this sort of, we pointed out, and I remember writing articles at the time, that this indulgence in a kind of victim narrative of saying that if anything bad happens to you, it will affect your life forever. And, you know, the whole kind of like Me Too, I'm a victim to Me Too thing was not good for women in the long run, that it was going to particularly teach young women that there are sort of obstacles that they can't get over in their lives, that men are to be, you know, to be feared, that relationships are always going to be fraught with these kind of things. So much spun off from Me Too, you know, the idea that you should have consent classes at university level, the idea that we should be teaching kids at school about how to hold hands properly, you know, the idea that workplaces should bring in particular kind of policies. You know, I remember some of them at the time, you know, one place said, you know, bring in a kind of no staring for longer than 10 seconds rule, you know, things like this. And we were making the point of, because Spiked was always a freedom orientated magazine, that everything came back to a defense of freedom. We were saying, oh, this is just closing in on women's lives. This is just like, there are, in the kind of guise of protections, there are all these limits being put down on people's lives. So I remember writing about that. And then I think probably my best moment at Spiked ever was, we got to go to America, and me and some of my colleagues, we went to America, and we went to to Philadelphia, to a university there, and I got to interview Camille Paglia, who is a world-renowned art critic, film critic, and she's written so many books on pop culture and things like that, but she's also very well known as a leading feminist in America, leading kind of she's written lots of books and given some really groundbreaking talks on women's rights and women's freedom, and how men and women are different from each other, and a lot of it some of it I don't agree with, but she gave us this interview that was about free speech and women and kind of the Me Too issue, and she was just caustic and terrifyingly intimidating to interview. I mean, if anyone has watched a YouTube video of Camille Paglia, she does not stop talking. She is a powerhouse, and I was just quaking in my boots thinking, I don't know a thing, and I'm daring to go to America to interview this woman who's obviously a lot older than me and a lot more experienced. But she was great. She was just great fun. And in particular, one of the things that she recounted was the thing that's a very controversial point she's made throughout the years, which lots of people don't understand, but is, I think is probably the central criticism I have of contemporary feminism, where she talked about the fact that she was part of a generation of women who, when they went to college, there were rules for dormitories in loco parentis rules, where you would have, the men were pretty much allowed in their single sex dorms to go and do whatever they liked. But women had minders, you had curfews, you had, you weren't allowed to, if you had someone in the room with you, you weren't allowed to shut the door fully. There was some phrase that she used, it was like, door open, 1 foot on the floor, which was that you couldn't have a boy round to your dormitory, no way. And and remember, these are university students, so these are adults, these are legal adults who can legally have sex and do what they want,
make their own decisions.
And she said that she told about the fact that when she was a student, she and a group of other women led a campaign to get rid of these rules, and they protested about them. And she said the central thing that we said was, we demand the freedom to risk rape, because the entirety of the protections and regulations that she had to suffer under was explained to them by the university administrators, that the world is a dangerous place, men are horrible, and what we're really just doing is stopping you from being raped. And if you're allowed to do what you want, what will happen is the world will come crashing down around you and you'll be abused. And so they said, we don't care if that happens, then that happens, and that's life. But we don't care. Rather than being treated like children, what we do is we want to risk being raped. And in actual fact, obviously, it's not the case that if you have freedom, every man's going to come and try and assault you. That's nonsense. But it was a really brave thing to do at the time, and it really made a difference for particularly, obviously women then, but I think it set a kind of gauntlet down for women in the future that I think, unfortunately, we've been failing to live up to, which is that, you prioritize freedom over everything else. And that if you don't have the freedom to do what you want with your life, to go where you want, to see who you want in the privacy of your own life, then you're not an adult individual, you're being treated like a child. And that was really groundbreaking for me, meeting her. So I think that was probably my highlight, was going to Philadelphia, getting a Philly cheesesteak, and then meeting Camille Paglia. Yeah, that was great.
We move away from your time at Spiked, covering important issues as a journalist, and you've mentioned some of the highlights and some of the articles that you've written and people you've spoken to. We now move on to establishing the Battle of Ideas Festival with your colleague, Alistair Donald. Can I ask you, when was the festival established? What was the thinking behind it? And what were the challenges in launching the festival and getting it off the ground?
Well, so I did not launch the festival, and I'll be killed if my colleagues hear that, because the festival, the Battle of Ideas Festival, is organised by the Academy of Ideas, and this is the 17th year of the festival. So it started way back in the early 2000s and was founded and launched by a woman called Claire Fox, who is the director of the Academy of Ideas. Some of you might now know her as she's just very recently been made a member of the House of Lords, but Claire is a political campaigner and a thinker and writer and commentator who's been behind a huge amount of political campaigns throughout her adult career, her adult lifetime, and set up the Academy of Ideas as a place that was to be the home of freedom and free thought, and primarily an events organization which was centered around public events. So kind of the idea of having a public square that was enlivened with discussion, where that politics didn't just happen in Parliament, that it didn't just happen in party conference, as we've just seen with the Labour and Conservative Party conferences this year, but that it actually happens in people's homes, on the bus, in their workplaces, in the pub. And so the Battle of Ideas Festival was an attempt is an ongoing attempt every year to give a home to that sense of public debate. So it's taking place this year in a week, on the 15th and 16th of October, in Church House in Westminster, which is a big venue, public venue in Westminster. And it used to be, for years, it was at the Barbican. It was also in other places all around London. It's had various guises. And it's, 48 hours of sort of up to 100 debates on everything, on, political realignment and whether or not people are going to vote Tory or Labour in the next election, and political apathy and political homelessness, and whether that's a big problem, to questions about curing cancer and whether or not we have to change our lifestyles, or whether it's all in the kind of science and tech, to issues about free speech online, and whether Elon Musk is going to be the savior or the sinner for those of us who are interested in Twitter as a kind of public space for discourse. Arts and culture. It's the 100th anniversary of Ulysses this year, so we're having a discussion on Ulysses and modernism, and all kinds of other political things you can think of. What's going on in schools and education, as I mentioned at the start of this interview, whether or not we've kind of relying too much on the idea that school is this sort of like place where we nurture children in this very lovely kind of well-being way, and whether we've lost sight of the fact that actually it's where you're meant to learn things about the world. And problems with the university, but also problems in our big institutions, like whether the civil service has gone to hell in a handcart, and what's going on in the NHS, and everything you can think of. We try and put a debate in on something, but the thing that gathers it all together, rather than it just being sort of disparate sets of interesting conversations, is this idea that our motto is free speech allowed. And it's this idea that you come to the Battle of Ideas as a kind of a people's parliament, where you take yourself and your fellow peers seriously, and you have public debates, and the audience, get stuck into one another, get stuck into the speakers, trying to figure out what we want from the world. It's very future orientated, actually, about figuring out, what we can learn from the past in order to figure out what we want from the future. And it's a very exciting weekend. And I joined the Academy of Ideas after I left Spike to become a freelance journalist. I still am a freelance journalist and commentator, but then went to work for the work with the Academy of Ideas, organising the festival, because I'd been to the festival for years as a younger woman. Always enjoyed it. I spoke once or twice, a few times at it, and to now be in my 3rd or 4th year as one of the organisers is wonderful. It's for the last 3 months has been, it's a very difficult thing to put together. Not just the logistical side of it, but also because, what have we had this year? We've had war in the heart of Europe, the death of a monarch, changing prime ministers, economic Armageddon, it seems like, and trying to fit that into a program is just a nightmare, but it's part of the challenge of it. So the Battle of Ideas Festival is a real home for anyone who wants to talk about the world. That's the main thing. Stop shouting at the telly is what we always say. Stop shouting at the telly and throwing the newspaper in the bin, and get out into the world and come with us, where you get into a room with sort of thousands of other people and stick your hand up and say what you have to say.
That slogan you just mentioned kind of struck a chord with me. I should stop shouting at the telly, because it's almost become a male midlife crisis from my perspective. Ella, you touched upon being a freelance writer, and you write regularly for the Critic and the Telegraph, and you've also become a regular contributor on radio and television with appearances on Question Time, Sky News, LBC, Women's Hour, and many more outlets. Why do you think you've become the go-to person by the media to talk and debate the topical issues of the day? And do you enjoy the forum of television and radio to express your ideas and your opinions?
Oh God, I wouldn't say I'm the go-to. I think that's giving me far too much credit.
I've seen you a lot of things, in fairness.
That's yeah, no, that does my ego wonders, but that's not reality. I think the thing that people don't realize is that the world of media and commentating is sometimes really disheartening, because you will write a wonderful article that you've researched for weeks and you've been thinking about, really seriously in-depth thing, and your mates might read it and people might read it, and you'll never know. But if the way the media works at the moment, which is has its ups and downsides, is that won't get you anywhere. But if you tweet something sarky, then you'll get a phone call from a producer. And so have always approached the world of kind of TV and radio in particular with a sort of slight level of not cynicism, but it's kind of like that unfortunately increasingly debate in a kind of mainstream public forum is not as in-depth as it could be. You get invited onto certain channels to kind of shout at someone for 5 minutes and your time's up. But the reason why I think it's worth doing, and why I'll always say yes to anything really, is because the exciting thing is that you've got a platform. That's the kind of privileged thing. And the exciting thing is that if you're saying something on a radio station, doesn't matter really how poxy or anything like that, someone is listening to you, and that's your audience. And if you care about things, and you're interested in things, you want to change, for me, I want to change the way women's politics is headed, or I particularly care about a certain issue, whether it's, recently it was telemedical abortion provision or things like that. I want to, and actually quite recently, because being pregnant and everything, I've been interested in the way in which maternity services have been working. And there's been some really harrowing scandals coming out over the last sort of few months about how maternity provision is changing, and how failures in the system have meant that there have been some real tragedies. And so, if you care about something, you want to talk about it, then having a platform to force people to listen to you is a really exciting thing. And I think probably the reason why I'm still getting invited on places is because we at the Academy of Ideas and at Spiked and other places have a very hard line on free speech, which is a very uncompromising position that I have never wavered on, which is that freedom of speech comes with no ifs and no buts. That means you don't say freedom of speech if you're nice about it. That means you don't say freedom of speech if you support this particular policy. You say everyone should be allowed to say what they want. And that still kind of makes people balk. And I still, every time I kind of voice that kind of opinion on the airwaves or wherever, people think you're mad, because people think that you just want a horrible world where everyone shouts at each other and says nasty things, and racists rule the day. And in actual fact, that's where the second kind of main pillar of my politics comes in, which is that Spiked has its motto, which is humanity is underrated. And that goes hand in hand with free speech, which is that in actual fact, when you give people the freedom to voice their opinions in the public square, like we do at the Battle of Ideas Festival, or online, or wherever it is, Twitter is a kind of a weird exception. Twitter is just this sort of odd place, but most of the time, people live up to the challenge and they don't call each other mean names, and they don't act ridiculously. They actually take themselves quite seriously. One of the most exciting examples of this was the Brexit referendum of 2016, which, I was a Leave voter, in which you had, whether you were Leave or Remain, people were rowing in a genuinely kind of very politically in-depth way all the time. There were people, I remember, sort of, it's not an exaggeration, hearing people on the tube talking about it. It was just like, it felt like the entire country was sort of hashing things out with one another. And it was people talk about the Brexit referendum and all that moment as some kind of dark period of Britain's history. But for me, it was like, I've never thought politics was more exciting than that. It was just so electric, and people were really paying attention to what we'd had years of political apathy, and suddenly everyone cared about this thing, no matter what side you were on. And so I think, maybe it's that, I'm sort of people see me as a bit of an alien because I'm a left-wing Brexit supporting free speech absolutist, and like, it's like, what, I thought everybody who was for free speech was a right winger, and I thought everyone who was for Brexit was a kind of Little Englander. Maybe that's it, but I think actually it's because if you're challenging the kind of traditional orthodoxy of censorship, it was become the traditional orthodoxy these days of censorship, and you've got something to say about free speech, I think people are always going to be interested, because whether or not it's the sort of top line in the mainstream media, people out there who are listening to the radio, who are out in the street, certainly the people that come to the Battle of Ideas Festival, want to talk about issues in a free and frank way, want to have open public debate. So I think I think maybe that's why I still get invited on to be a loudmouth.
Ella, I think you've probably partly already answered this next question, but you're very much an advocate of free thinking, political debate, and free speech, and it's one of your great passions. But how would you describe your political beliefs and convictions? And how do you currently look at the current state of British politics? And what do you think will happen at the next election in 2 years, or maybe sooner than 2 years if we do have a snap election?
Oh, politics at the moment is I know it's not, it's like to say something positive, wouldn't you? But Jesus, I mean,
it's very hard, isn't it?
It's very hard, because I think the main problem is not just because the Conservative Party is just they're just mad. They're just like, Liz Truss is just, I don't even think asleep at the wheel is the right phrase, because it's just sort of actually playing politics a lot of the time. I think the kind of Tory leadership race and ousting Boris, as much as, I think Boris wasn't a great prime minister, and his conduct in terms of partying and all of that was reprehensible. I mean, the whole sort of indulgence of having this very internal sort of competition and ending up with Liz Truss pulling policies out of a hat, like, today we're going to do this with tax, tomorrow we're going to ban strikes, and all this kind of stuff seems just very, the problem I have with it is it's extremely insubstantial, and because it's insubstantial, it's causing havoc. The fact that we're in a kind of a genuine cost of living crisis, and people keep talking about tax, tax doesn't, the levels of tax rates and tax changes does not change the average working class people's living conditions. It does not change their ability to get better wages. It just is tinkering with, actually it's tinkering with the top level, which is what the Conservatives were doing, and kind of got all the flack for the 45p cut and all that sort of stuff. So my problem is that there are no ideas on the table. And if you turn to the opposition, the Labour Party, and you look at what Keir Starmer had to say in conference, the key line that he came out with is, we are going to be fiscally responsible, and we are now going to be the party of sound money. And again, there is no ideas in that. There is, what does that mean? What kind of technocratic crap is that? We're gonna balance if I hear one more person talk about balancing the books don't work for anyone. The books don't mean anything. you throw the book out, do something different. Particularly with the economy, you have to realize, and this is something that we're addressing at length at the Battle of Ideas Festival, is that people, commentators and my fellow colleagues in the press seem to think that all the problems related to the economy, the fact that energy bills are skyrocketing, the fact that people are finding themselves unable to make ends meet and all the rest of it, is has just happened in the last year, or even the last 3 years because of COVID, or 1 year because of the war in Ukraine, not remembering that the British economy has been in the doldrums for decades now, that there are very serious, deep-rooted problems related to production that have to be addressed. The fact that everybody says, oh, we don't make anything in this country anymore, that is one of the fundamental problems, is that you do not have a productive economy. And so screwing around with tax rates isn't going to do anything in relation to that. And I think this is kind of, if I was trying to place my sort of politics today, obviously I have a certain kind of left-wing ideology about how I would like to handle the economy and things like that. I mean, I'm appalled by the Conservatives, actually, and the Labour Party's inability to talk about how terrible it is that people have to pick between heating and eating, and isn't that awful? And then, Labour Party not supporting striking workers, and the Conservative Party bringing in policy that's going to basically outlaw strikes completely. So there's a real sort of use and abuse of the working class in terms of the rhetoric of politicians today, that they like to hold us up as this sort of stage army that they can feel pity for. But when any of us try and exercise our political power on picket lines, then that's a no-no. But I think actually the key problem we have today, and so much comes back to this, is an issue of democracy, and an issue of a disrespect for and a kind of doing away with democracy that was felt most keenly in the aftermath of the Brexit vote, of people being basically made shit of, and the vote being denied for 6 years. But in all other areas of politics too, this idea that it's a kind of a mainstream view that politics is something that is done to people. So politicians and governments should bring in legislation to police our lives, which is in very anti-democratic and democratic ways, rather than actually taking democracy and the idea that every man and woman has as much right to be involved in politics as the Lord, the judge, and the politician. And so I think I describe myself as a kind of radical free speech Democrat, and see where that gets me. I think those are the kind of free speech and democracy are the key kind of dividing lines at the moment in terms of politics.
I share your sentiment on a lot of the things that you just mentioned. I particularly become apathetic and disillusioned. But I kind of wanted to pick up on the free thinking thing, because, and you said about people's democratic rights, but do you think we are partly guilty as well of putting too much faith in our political leaders and figures? Also, we become obsessed almost with slogans, punchlines that sound fancy and can be put on the headlines of papers. And do you also think journalists are slightly guilty, if you watch Newsnight, for example, every night, of not letting them have a word in edgeways? And it's almost, like you say, it's almost constantly, the dialogue is always very aggressive, and you almost feel that a member of the current government or the opposition can't really say what they actually want to say or express, because they'll be crucified in the newspapers or in the media for saying actually what they really want to say.
Yeah, it's called gotcha politics, and it's it's a problem, which is that so much, not to disparage my colleagues in the peers in the press, but there is an issue with lines of questioning focusing around that kind of haha, I got you moment. This is really sort of exemplified with the sort of parties in number 10 thing, which was this obsession with this idea that you'd caught a minister out because he'd had a canapé at the wrong time in the wrong place, and the rest of the I don't have a crystal ball, I can't talk for the rest of the country, but to me anyway, it felt that people were just sick, as much as the arrogance, the disgusting arrogance of mainstream politicians of breaking the rules that they set was was a problem. This kind of like obsession with sort of the superficiality of what was happening in Number 10, and the kind of like, people shouting, members of the press shouting at politicians in press conferences, and this whole kind of, it was just like carnivalesque kind of thing that was happening, was so insubstantial. And actually what people wanted, anyway, what I wanted was to hold the government to account on the questions of the policies they enacted throughout the pandemic. Answer the questions as to whether or not you're going to let everybody who was arrested under a COVID regulation, whether you're going to let them off and reimburse them their fines now that you've been doing the same in Number 10, whether it was right to bring in successive lockdowns and keep kids off school, whether it was right to flip and arrest people on park benches, think like the kind of the substantial things that actually happened that mattered to people's lives.
And in fairness, some of those arguments you make, you could almost argue that the opposition pretty much failed to do that, because they pretty much backed the government with pretty much everything they brought in under legislation during the pandemic. I can rarely remember a moment where the opposition challenged any of this legality to do with the lockdowns and closing of schools. They pretty much supported everything, didn't they, that the government did during that period.
Keir Starmer was a nodding dog for Boris Johnson. There was no point at which the opposition said, hang on a minute, you have just enacted unbelievable emergency legislation under the most undemocratic circumstances. Remember kind of like it became the norm at some point where a minister would just sort of like 5 minutes before it made law say, oh, by the way, we're enacting law that says that you can't have funerals, or whatever it was, that you can't go see your parents in the care home. Sorry, no time to debate it. Here it is on the statute books. Boom, tick, it's in law. Just like crazy, completely authoritarian measures that were being taken, no matter the kind of content of them, the way in which they were enacted. There was not a squeak from the Labour benches, because they were okay, if you were to be generous, which we should be at times. There was a pandemic happening, and particularly in the early stages of it, I think, very few people knew what was happening, and there was a national kind of sense that steps had to be taken quickly, and you weren't going to have time for months of talking about it in the chambers, just like, do something. That was fine at the start, but in the next 2 years there was definitely space for an opposition government to come in and say, hang on a minute, I think possibly you shutting schools down for the third time, when we now have a vaccine and know that kids aren't going to die from it in the same way that, for example, the elderly and the infirm are at risk of death from COVID. Maybe a bit of a problem. Can we maybe talk about this? But no, in fact, Labour pushed for harder, faster, stronger, longer lockdowns. So I think that's a real problem, is that this is something that, lots of people would deny, and maybe is less true now with the kind of wild stuff that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng are coming out with in terms of their mini budget. But I think on most political issues, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party are closer than people think, that there is actually very little room for ideological battles between them, to keep coming back to Brexit. But obviously we know that the vast majority of politicians on all sides of the House, with all colours of rosettes, were against that. And that was in direct contrast to the fact that you had the majority of the British voting public being for it, on issues related to things like the debate about gender and trans ideology. There's a real consensus. The debate about mental health and women's issues, every politician is a sort of like the paid up superficial feminist and thinks that we should, have more police intervention into women's lives, and they'll sort of clap along to the idea of anti-misogyny, hate crime, things like that. There's no kind of like huge ideological rifts. And the problem with that is that there's actually not much choice on offer. And so I think you asked at one point what would happen in a snap election or in an election in 2 years. Unfortunately, I think lots of people aren't going to vote. And I can't, I certainly am not. And if there's no option better than this, and I don't blame them, I think there should be, we should be a bit more like the French and take spoiling our ballots seriously, and, try and kind of find something different than these tired institutions. I mean, the Labour Party is trying to, reinvigorate Blair in some kind of
this
tame version,
centre ground politics again.
Yeah, and obviously
realign with the centre.
Yeah, and Liz Truss has kind of like dug up Thatcher and put on her blazer and her clip-on earrings. It's like, there's nothing new. There's no kind of big and in actual fact, most people know that there's a lot of kind of crossover between sort of the way in which Thatcherism and Blairism approached the public and thought about the working class. So it doesn't look rosy. It doesn't look rosy for the future unless, and this is the key point, unless we as citizens who aren't able to sit in the nice green leather chairs in Parliament, or even, like me, jump on some radio station and sound off, people who understand that politics happens in the public square, not in these kind of like quiet, nice rooms of the BBC or of the palaces of Westminster, start saying something. I'm quite interested in this campaign, Enough is Enough. I think, there's too Labour orientated, but there's something going on there. The fact that you've got wildcat strikes and organised unionised strikes happening throughout this summer means that people are, being politically active. The fact that, even things like sort of little protests about low traffic neighbourhoods in people's local areas, or, fuel protests, or that kind of Don't Pay UK campaign, just people not being apathetic and saying, actually, I've got an idea of how to do things. I could do things better than them, and hashing out ideas in the public square to then put pressure on the people who actually have the power to change politics, to do something about it, whether that's your politicians or whether that's, I'd love to see a whole new party of something. I don't know what, and I'm not going to lead it because I don't know what, but, something different. And a very small part of that is what we try to do at the Battle of Ideas Festival. I think that's the only way that politics is going to change, because if you sit at home and think that Keir Starmer or Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak or Angela Rayner or anyone who's involved in it at the moment is going to come up with the next big idea to change the world, then you're sorely mistaken. I think we've got to let go of our lazy reliance on having other people change the world for us. We've got to do it.
Ella, some fascinating insights and perspective on the current state of politics, which seems to change day by day, U-turn after U-turn. But I wanted to move away from politics. We're coming towards the interview, and on a little bit of maybe a lighter tone now. Outside of your busy working life, there's many things you've done which we've not touched upon. Your Lobster Films, where you make content and documentaries that you're currently releasing. But I wanted to ask you what your interests outside of your work, and do you have any future ambitions of other things you want to go on and do and conquer or explore?
It's hard because for me, politics is my life. It's not just a job, and it's not just it's good crack going on Question Time and things like that, and it's fun, and I'm serious about it. I want to put forward particular kind of views and try and change even just the world of that room, rather than the world at large. But it's also what when I get home, of an evening, it's what me and my partner talk about and row about. And it's, you know, I think if you are someone who's really interested in it, it doesn't stop when you pull the keys of the work door shut. It's my whole life. And I've just got these pamphlets that we publish at the Academy of Ideas, and there's some new ones there, and I spend a lot of my time commissioning them and editing them. And it's not what I'm trying to say, it's not a job to me, it's my life, it's what I do, it's what I'll do until I die probably. But I'm going to be taking a step back in 5 days when I have this baby. It's my first baby, and it took us a long time to get here. We had to do several rounds of IVF because we had fertility problems, and there was, like, you know, it was a real eye-opener to the way in which the kind of things of the medicine, what things I'd learned, things about medicine and the human body and stuff like that I'd never known before, that were fascinated me. And I'm looking forward to not maybe turning the radio off for 10 days or so and just getting immersed in raising a kid and being a mum, something I've wanted to be for so long and haven't been able to be. So I'm really going to relish that for as long as I can. And maybe this is sort of like the thing I promised my dad, get back into music, because I love music. I used to be in a band when I was young, and I used to do a lot of open mics and things like that. And I've got my guitar stood up against the wall that I haven't, my fingers, people be ashamed of me, my fingers are so soft, I haven't touched the strings in probably years. So my sort of vision is that I'm going to have this baby, I'm going to read loads of books that I've got a stack that I haven't touched in ages, big tomes of things that I've all the classics that I've neglected, and I'm going to get back into being a sort of semi-guitarist and try and do that. So I've got a long wish list. In reality, probably if you ask me in 4 months, I'll just have, like, sick in my hair and be knackered. But there are also other things to life than talking about quasi-quartins, flipping mini budget, being out with your family and doing the things you love, even if that's playing bad tunes on a guitar, I think is really important. So yeah, I'm looking forward to a little bit of something different.
I share your love of music. I have a passion for, I suppose I think of myself as being a bit of a wordsmith or wannabe wordsmith. I love writing songs, and the channel's been very musically orientated. A lot of the guests have been from musical backgrounds, and I can see
the guitar in the background of your
I play very badly, but yeah, I'd share this love of music, a passion of mine, a bit like your passion for politics and free thinking. Ella, we come on to that time. We ask every single guest the same set of questions to finish the Your Take interview today. We try to establish things we've maybe not found out during the course of this interview. They're quick fire questions. You ready for this?
Yeah.
It's like being in the psychiatrist's chair.
Yeah.
So, Ella Whelan, we've done about 80 of these so far. We ask all the guests the same questions. You don't need to think about these at any great length. Here they go. Here we are. What would you say, Ella, is your favorite pastime?
Watching crap telly. In all honesty.
What kind of crap telly?
Like what do I love? Don't Tell the Bride is one of my favorites, and reruns of Seinfeld, which isn't crap actually, that's a fantastic sitcom, Sopranos, but also I'm watching the new Game of Thrones, and it's the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. It's terrible, but I won't stop. So I do like to vegetate in front of the telly, Cash in the Attic and all that sort of stuff. I love all that.
Interestingly, we moved from the medium of television now to cinema, but what would you cite as your favorite film, and why?
Oh, I love Martin McDonagh films, and his brother, I can't remember his brother's name, but the two McDonagh brothers. So The Guard, Calvary, and they've got a new one coming out called the Banshees of Inisherin, which I'm really excited to go for. It's a kind of a they're second generation Irish brothers who, in particular, I love their plays. The Lieutenant Vinishmore and the Beauty Queen of Llannan, written by Martin McDonagh, are just these amazingly funny, dark plays that are so, this so Irish and Irish humor in a way that only a kind of second generation Irish person can do it as in a sort of viewpoint like that. And they're just so funny and moving and incredible. So yeah, I'd probably say anything by the McDonagh brothers, and even some of their American stuff like Three Billboards in Ebbing, Missouri. I could watch them again and again and again. They're wonderful.
That's a tremendous film. They did In Bruges as well, didn't they?
And In Bruges, of course, which is probably the best one. I didn't remember it, but that's, this new film is The Banshees of Inisherin, has Brendan Gleeson and Colin Farrell come back together again.
Them,
which is that's what I'm most excited about, because they just are brilliant together. And In Bruges is a masterpiece because it's so emotional and yet so kind of irreverent and funny. So it's a real kind of Irish humor thing of just sort of talking about the most terrible things, but laughing at the same time. So I love them.
Rolf Fiennes is great in that one, as well as the villain. We move from film now to novels. Who would you say is your favorite novelist?
It changes all the time, and I'm now outing myself as this kind of person who's culturally not very explorative, because I mainly read Irish and watch Irish stuff. But Claire Keegan is an Irish novelist and short story writer who's just got a new book out called Small Things Like These. And she writes these little stories about just life in Ireland. And it's just, just one family. And the most recent one is about a man who's a delivery driver for coal in a sort of village. And he is delivering coal to a convent, and he discovers some things. And it's not the plots aren't dramatic. It's just kind of like a person's life, but the way she writes is just leaves your jaw hanging open. So I'd recommend Claire Keegan to anyone who's, her short stories collections, like Walk the Blue Hills, I think it is, and she's a Wicklow writer, so it's where my family's from. That makes me sound like a very sort of parochial kind of person who only reads people who are from the area she's in. But Claire Keegan is, I think it's probably Claire Keegan at the moment. But it does change.
We've established today that you've done so many different things and you have this passion for politics. But if you could have chosen a different profession, what do you think it would have been?
I know exactly what it would be, because it's what I fantasize all the time. I'd love to be a school music teacher. When I was at school, I had this music teacher called Mr. Werner. And I was in the choir, and I was in anything I could be in, I would get into. And the kind of group, there's nothing like, I try and be in choirs now, and have been in a few in around the area that live in. But there's nothing like being in a big group of people playing music, whether it's a band or, at school we used to do it we'd have the whole school orchestra and the choir singing together. And it was just, when I listened to my music going along the road, I always imagine what would it be like to be conducting a school, I don't know why a school choir, but or a school band. So if I had my time again, I would have taken my piano lessons seriously when I was a kid, and I would have stuck with it, and I would have studied music, and I'd be a music teacher, because I'd love to be that. Maybe later on in life I can do volunteer somewhere or something like that. I have to reteach myself how to read music. But yes, being involved in music and kids in that kind of big scale, I think I'd love it. And I love that teacher, Mr. Werner, and I really admire anyone who's involved in anything like that.
The love of music comes up again, and the desire to play music again. Next, I wanted to ask you, who in life has been your greatest inspiration?
Oh, that's hard, because I'd have to pick, but it's probably the answer that lots of people give, but it's my parents, because they are they're people who have didn't, unlike everyone in, you know, mainstream politics, didn't have some kind of like a steering life course into it, but just genuinely wanted to change the world and had a, you know, used the life that they were living, and the people they met and the experiences they had to inform, and the books they read, and, you know, kind of being autodidacts to shape their understanding of the world. And they gave that to me and my brother in a way that was, you know, just challenging us to think about things, and never really sort of letting us sit on our laurels in terms of thinking about things politically. And I probably have to say my husband, because he is also someone who, you know, grew up in kind of farm in rural southwest, and there was no one political around him, and he just started when he was a teenager reading books in a library. He's a total autodidact, and, you know, started sneaking off to conferences when he was a kid, telling his, you know, when he was a young man, teenager, telling his parents that he was staying over at someone's house, but actually sleeping on some kind of function room in London to go to a conference in UCL. And he's, you know, never done, even though he says now that he's sick of it all and is jaded. In fact, he's never done thinking about the world. So I think probably, yeah, my family, for who, you know, I'll write an article and they'll say, yeah, that's all right, but did you think about it this way? You know, and so kind of, you know, they're always challenging you to think a bit deeper.
Newspapers up next. You've written for a few, so this could be interesting. Do you read a newspaper? And if so, which one?
It's become as no surprise that I read Spiked. That's my main, and because, you know, the people that they get to, some of the writers that they have, Phil Mullen on the economy, you know, Brendan O'Neill's columns are really insightful, and something that you'll never get anything like what happens on Spiked anywhere else. There's nowhere like it. But I do, you know, I go all over the place. And in fact, the paper that I like to buy when I buy a paper is The Guardian. Even though politically a lot of the stuff I wouldn't agree with it. Certainly the kind of identity politics aspect of things and culture wars aspect, I think they're full of crap. But I really like the paper, and I think some of the writers in it are fantastic. I also read, you know, go to, you know, the Telegraph for a lot of culture stuff. I write for the culture desk there, and they have a really fantastic arts and culture department. But there's so much on offer these days. I mean, if we were talking 10 years ago, we wouldn't have the Critic, we wouldn't have Unheard, we wouldn't have, you know, outlets like Novara Media, outlets like, you know, there's lots of stuff, new stuff happening in the world of media that's actually.
It's interesting you mentioned Unheard, because I picked up on that channel during the pandemic, and I think it's a great platform, and I really enjoy listening to, I think it's Eddie Sayers, the interviewer and journalist. Yeah, very good platform.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, that's the thing about the exciting thing is that there are some different the introduction of social media, but also online publications. I mean, I do love a paper. I do like to have a paper. And yeah, okay, I admit part of the reason why I buy The Guardian is because I like the crossword in the inside slip. It's a very good crossword. So I, you know, I like that, and I think I wouldn't want to let go of print media. But there's a lot of exciting things happening online. And of course, Spiked was the original online magazine. It was the first online magazine in the UK, I think, back in the early 2000s. So there's a wealth of different sort of, and some of it's not worth your time. I mean, there's the part of the problem with online media is that there's 1,000,001 bloggers who think they've got earth-shattering things to say, and they don't. But that's part of the democracy of the internet. That's the part of the exciting thing. It's the same with Twitter. You know, you'll sift through 3,000 tweets that are not even worth finishing, however short they are, to find one thread from someone where you think, oh, I never have heard that viewpoint before unless I'd found that. So, you know, it's a good world for people who want to explore ideas.
Come on to cuisine and cookery. But Ella, what would you say is your favorite food?
My favorite food is probably very unoriginal. I love pasta. I love Yeah, I love pasta. We bought ourselves from eBay old pasta maker. I love making pasta. Probably really badly. Probably there'll be Italian grandmothers who look at the kind of sauce I make and want to shoot me because it's so awful in English and not done the proper way. But anything Italian, I love. And we went there for our honeymoon after we got married, and had the best meals in the world. So yeah, probably Italian food and pasta.
From a love of Italian food now to picking your favorite cultural icon, who would you choose?
Cultural icon.
It could be someone, a political figure. It could be someone from history, maybe someone who's made an impact on our lives in some sort of way with a design of something, maybe something technological.
That is really hard. That's really hard. I'm just going to go and say the person who I turn to the most is probably a singer. It's not very adventurous. Ry Cooder. I think the Ry Cooder's sound and
Ry Cooder's an absolute legend.
Yeah, well, okay, good.
He's an incredible musician for starters, and somebody with great integrity, someone that's never necessarily gone with the money or sold out, has always done stuff that he's wanted to do.
Yeah.
With great musical expression, and one of the best, finest guitarists I've ever heard.
Yeah, and I think I've always been fascinated with America and the kind of like the cultural world of America and the sort of various kind of cultural trends and ideas that have come out of all the different parts of America. And he just has that sort of American sound that some of his work on the album Paris, Texas, and it's just like, I don't think anyone's created that kind of scene setting music before where you can just listen to it and immediately be somewhere else. And when I was going to Philadelphia, when I was in America, I got a Greyhound on my own, actually to Washington, because we had a different job in Washington. And I was obsessed with his song, I Got Mine. And I just listened to it on repeat, and I was looking out the window like, I'm on a Greyhound in America listening to Ry Cooder. This is, my dreams have come true. I'm in a film. This is amazing. So yeah, I think, it'd have to be Ry Cooder. I mean, there's lots of people I admire, but music is my main thing that I think and love outside of the world of politics. So I should pick a singer and a musician. So Ry Cooder.
Ry Cooder's an interesting choice, and that is a beautiful soundtrack, Paris, Texas, with that slide guitar and a stunning Wim Wenders film. Ella, completely different now. What would you say is your favorite curse word and why?
I'd probably say the F word more than anything else, which much to my mother thinks it's awful. But there are some really good swear words there are really some very good Irish insults and swear words. Obviously everybody knows gobshite, but there's one that my dad uses that I think is so underused and people should use it more, which is a go be the wall, which is, if you actually break it down, it's a go be the wall, go by the wall. And it's someone who creeps a lot, someone who goes by the wall, who creeps along in corners and is, not a wallflower, but someone who's just a snaky kind of shyster who's you should keep your eye on. And so there's loads of stuff like that where you just think it's gobbledygook, it's nonsense, but actually it means something. It means something really good and specific. I think they've got a lot of words like this in German as well, but I'm not good at German. But yeah, there's some pretty good Irish curses that I should use more in a contemporary context that are slightly more intellectually rigorous than just the F word, but unfortunately probably is the F word that I use most.
From a curse word claiming one to be a shyster or a snake in the grass, we now go to favourite places or holiday destinations. What would you choose?
the place I go most to, and where we only went to most, was Ireland when we were young. But so I won't pick that because it's boring and I've said too much Irish stuff. The place I want to go to is the kind of southern states in America. I want to do a road trip there. There was this documentary that I think you can get on YouTube with Jules Holland. I can't remember what it's called, Walking to New Orleans or something like that, where he's really young in it, and he gets this beat up old car and he does a tour of some of the southern states, and he goes and interviews all these different musical figures. Dr. I can't remember.
Dr. John.
Dr. John,
Yeah.
and he plays kind of Zydeco music with this other guy in this band. It's such a good documentary, and I just thought, oh my God, I want to go there. Unfortunately, my partner does not like country music, so it will be I'll have to either drag. I'm obsessed with country music, but either I'll have to drag him along or do it myself. But just to go into some of those places and all along the bayou and stuff like that, and see the areas that I've listened to and watched in films so many times, Mississippi and all that kind of stuff. I'd love to go there. So that's my ambition, is at some point in my life I'm going to get a big Chevy and go and do the southern states. When I win the lottery, that's what I'm going to go and do.
You've whet my appetite with that documentary. I'm going to go and search that and check that out. And also, I share this love of country music. I completely get it. But oddly, we come back to music. Ella, what would you say, who would you say is your favorite music artist? And what would you cite as your all-time favorite album?
Not very good with albums because I'm terrible for jumping around. But I think probably it's Van Morrison, which isn't very original. And probably it's whichever album Into the Mystic is on, which is just the most beautiful song I think anyone's ever written, ever. And Van Morrison's got in for a lot of stick recently because he's slightly over the top in the kind of lockdown thing. Although I think he was very admirable in being a live artist who said, for Christ's sake, will you stop shutting down? Live venues is killing us, and he's to be commended for that. So slightly went into slightly anti-vax adjacent sort of area, but we'll forgive him that because he's a master. But his track record is incredible. There is not one Van Morrison song that I defy anyone to dislike a Van Morrison song. They're just too good. His band is too tight. His lyrics are too good. There's no one who can write like him. So it's probably Van Morrison. Yeah.
And then Ella, we move on to the final two questions. Firstly, what would you say is your greatest achievement to date?
I don't know that I've achieved all that much really, apart from probably managing to carry on being involved in politics and doing, helping to host events like the Battle of Ideas Festival, because sometimes it can, so the world of politics, as many people know, is sometimes a pretty brutal place, and you particularly when you're young and you've got friends who, like my friends who were on the different sides of the divide on the Brexit referendum, for example, or even on other political issues, and being able to say, I don't want to fall out with you, but I think you're fundamentally wrong about absolutely everything, is a trick that I've learned how to manage. And I think that would probably be it, being able to say that I stuck to my guns on certain issues, even when you become the person that no one likes in the room. There's been several times, particularly when I was younger, that I'd go talk at a university when I was with Spiked, where you'd be all but covered in rotten eggs, kind of, the kind of reactions that you'd get challenging some of the campus stuff in particular. And I was, I never backed down from that, that's what I'm probably proudest of, not not backing down. Maybe I cried on the train home, but at the time I didn't back down. And I think that's probably all we can say for ourselves, is that whatever you want to achieve, it's if you're sort of, I sound like some kind of awful sort of kumbaya bullshit at the moment, but being true to yourself in a genuine sense, sticking by your guns and sticking by your principles, I think is probably the only thing that we can really be really proud of.
And finally, Ella Whelan, the final question, we get very deep now. How do you wish to be remembered?
Oh, as someone who didn't fade into the background, probably, as someone who said what she thought. I think the times I've been most ashamed of myself and most upset was when I didn't say something, whether that's in my personal life or my political life, when I didn't have the courage to get up and say that I disagreed with something, or actually, even as is the case now with a lot of politics, to stand by someone who's being cancelled, or who's, to stand up in solidarity with someone. So I think if I can be remembered as someone who, I hope to be remembered as someone who was brave enough to say certain things. I think bravery is something that's very underrated these days. And I think that's probably what I would hope to. I haven't been a very brave person for a lot of my life. And that's something I'd like to work on. So I think being remembered as someone brave is probably the best thing that you can be remembered for.
A lovely way of closing the interview, today's interview. Thank you kindly for being a guest and taking time out of your busy working life to share your story and your passions, particularly for politics and free speech today. I kind of also feel honoured that you've chosen to do the interview when we see you on the likes of the BBC, Question Time, LBC and so on. So I feel kind of greatly honoured that you've accepted the interview and taken part today. And I wish you all the very best for all your endeavours in the future, the birth of your baby son or daughter, and hopefully there'll be a political deep thinker like yourself in the future, maybe one day.
Yeah, I won't. Hopefully, I won't try not to curse them by making them, being too rigid in what I make them. But no, thank you. It's been really interesting, and you've got a great lineup of guests on your show. So I'm very honoured to be part of them, and I hope some of your viewers and listeners and supporters will come along to the Battle of Ideas Festival on the 15th and 16th of October, and get in touch if you want some tickets, and if you can't afford them, we've got free tickets for volunteers. We know it's a difficult time at the moment, and that shouldn't stop you from coming and being part of a genuine public debate. So good luck with the show in the future, and thanks for having me on. Thank you kindly. And lastly, how do we find out more about the Battle of Ideas Festival coming up very soon, and more about yourself? So head to battleofideas.org.uk, and that's the home for the festival, or just search Battle of Ideas Festival in any kind of search engines, and you can see what we've got on the program. You can see with the ticket offers, we've got very cut price tickets for students, £27.50, and free tickets for school pupils. If you're unwaged or any kind of concessions, there's big concessions there. And like I said, if you can't spare any cash at all, which lots of people can't at the moment, don't let that stop you. All you got to do is help me run the microphones in the room, which is what volunteering entails, and you get free passes to the festival. So there's options for everyone. So yeah, battleofideas.org.uk, come find us. And as for me, just you can follow the Academy of Ideas, is where I do a lot of stuff, or follow me on Twitter, where I occasionally write something sarky but also publish things, publish information like our letters on liberty, that you can get a copy and read. So yeah, hope to see you there next weekend. Nothing wrong about sarcasm, but to close the interview today, thanks again for being a guest on Your Take, Ella Whelan. Thanks.